Hello friends and welcome back to Mirthful Diamond Paintings. I am Netta and this is part 6 of our diamond painting journey with The Italian by Ann Radcliffe. We are officially starting on the second row out of 5 on this canvas. Progress may be slow but we're getting there, one shiny drill at a time. Whether you are crafting along, multitasking or just listening in, you're absolutely welcome to treat this as your personal podcast corner, now with extra sparkle. A quick question while you work. Do you prefer working row by row or color by color when diamond painting? Let me know in the comments. I love hearing your process.
Chapter 7 of The Italian.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Italian by Ann Radcliffe, read by Gary Day. Chapter 6. The bell then, beating 1. Shakespeare. Vivaldi, meanwhile, ignorant of what had occurred at Villa Altieri, repaired, as he had proposed, to Paluzzi, attended by his servant Paolo. It was deep in the night before he left Naples, and so anxious was he to conceal himself from observation, that though Paolo carried a torch, he did not permit it to be lighted till after he should have remained some time within the archway, thinking it most prudent to watch a while in secret for his unknown adviser, before he proceeded to examine the fort. His attendant Paolo was a true Neapolitan, shrewd, inquisitive, insinuating, adroit, possessing much of the spirit of intrigue, together with a considerable portion of humour, which displayed itself not so much in words as in his manner and countenance, in the archness of his dark penetrating eye, and in the exquisite adaptation of his gesture to his idea. He was a distinguished favourite with his master, who, if he had not humour himself, had a keen relish of it in others, and who certainly did possess wit, with all its lively accompaniments, in an eminent degree. Vivaldi had been won by the naivety and humour of this man to allow him an unusual degree of familiarity in conversation, and as they now walked together towards Paluzzi, he unfolded to Paolo as much of his former adventure there as he judged necessary to interest his curiosity and excite his vigilance. The relation did both. Paolo, however, naturally courageous, was incredulous to superstition of any kind, and having quickly perceived that his master was not altogether indisposed to attribute to a supernatural cause the extraordinary occurrences at Paluzzi, he began in his manner to rally him. But Vivaldi was not in temper to endure jesting. His mood was grave, even to solemnity, and he yielded, though reluctantly, to the awe which at intervals returned upon him with the force of a magic spell, binding up all his faculties to sternness, and fixing them in expectation. While he was nearly regardless of defence against human agency, his servant was, however, preparing for that alone, and very properly represented the imprudence of going to Paluzzi in darkness. Vivaldi observed that they could not watch for the monk otherwise than in darkness, since the torch which lighted them would also warn him, and he had very particular reasons for watching before he proceeded to examine. He added that after a certain time had elapsed, the torch might be lighted at a neighbouring cottage. Paolo objected that in the meanwhile the person for whom they watched might escape, and Vivaldi compromised the affair. The torch was lighted, but concealed within a hollow of the cliffs that bordered the road, and the sentinels took their station in darkness within the deep arch, near the spot where Vivaldi had watched with Bonamo. As they did this, the distant chime of a convent informed Vivaldi that midnight was turned. The sound recalled to his mind the words of Schedoni concerning the vicinity of the convent of the Black Penitents to Paluzzi, and he asked Paolo whether this was the chime of that convent. Paolo replied that it was, and that a remarkable circumstance had taught him to remember the Santa del Pianto, or Our Lady of Tears. "The place, signor, would interest you," said Paolo, "for there are some odd stories told of it, and I am inclined to think this unknown monk must be one of that society. His conduct is so strange." "You believe, then, that I am willing to give faith to wonderful stories?" said Vivaldi, smiling. "But what have you heard that is so extraordinary respecting this convent? Speak low, or we may be discovered." "Why, signor, the story is not generally known," said Paolo in a whisper. "I half promised never to reveal it." "If you are under any promise of secrecy," interrupted Vivaldi, "I forbid you to tell this wonderful tale, which, however, seems somewhat too big to rest within your brain." "The story would fain expand itself to yours, signor," said Paolo; "and as I did not absolutely promise to conceal it, I am very willing to reveal it." "Proceed, then," said Vivaldi; "but let me once more caution you to speak low." "You are obeyed, signor. You must know, then, maestro, that it was on the eve of the festival of Santa Marco, and about 6 years since." "Peace," said Vivaldi. They were silent, but everything remaining still, Paolo, after some time, ventured to proceed, though in a yet lower whisper. It was on the eve of the Santo Marco, and when the last bell had rung, that a person... He stopped again, for a rustling sound passed near him. "You are too late," said a sudden voice beside Vivaldi, who instantly recognised the thrilling accents of the monk. "It is past midnight. She departed an hour ago. Look to your steps." Though thrilled by this well-known voice, Vivaldi scarcely yielded to his feelings for a moment; but checking the question which would have asked, "Who departed?" he, by a sudden spring, endeavoured to seize the intruder, while Paolo, in the first hurry of his alarm, fired a pistol, and then hastened for the torch. So certainly did Vivaldi believe himself to have leapt upon the spot whence the voice proceeded, that on reaching it he instantly extended his arms, and searching around, expected every moment to find his enemy in his grasp. Darkness again baffled his attempt. "You are known!" cried Vivaldi. "You shall see me at the Santa del Pianto." "What? Oh, Paolo, the torch! The torch!" Paolo, swift as the wind, appeared with it. "He passed up those steps in the rock, signor. I saw the skirts of his garments ascending." "Follow me, then," said Vivaldi, mounting the steps. "Away, away, maestro!" said Paolo impatiently. "But for heaven's sake, name no more the convent of the Santa del Pianto. Our lives may answer it." He followed to the terrace above, where Vivaldi, holding high the torch, looked around for the monk. The place, however, as far as his eye could penetrate, was forsaken and silent. The glare of the torch enlightened only the rude walls of the citadel, some points of the cliff below, and some tall pines that waved over them, leaving in doubtful gloom many a recess of the ruin, and many a tangled thicket that spread among the rocks beyond. "Do you perceive any person, Paolo?" said Vivaldi, waving the torch in the air to rouse the flame. "Among those arches on the left, signor. Those arches that stand duskily beyond the citadel. I thought I saw a shadowy sort of a figure pass." He might be a ghost by his silence, for aught I know, Maestro, but he seems to have good mortal instinct to take care of himself, and to have as swift a pair of heels to assist in carrying him off as any Lazzaro in Naples need desire." "Fewer words and more caution," said Vivaldi, lowering the torch and pointing it towards the quarter which Paolo had mentioned. "Be vigilant and tread lightly." "You are obeyed, signor, but their eyes will inform them, though their ears will refuse, while we hold a light to our own steps." "Peace with this buffoonery," said Vivaldi somewhat sternly. "Follow in silence, and be on your guard." Paolo submitted, and they proceeded towards the range of arches which communicated with the building, whose singular structure had formerly arrested the attention of Bonarmo, and whence Vivaldi himself had returned with such unexpected precipitancy and consternation. On perceiving the place he was approaching, he suddenly stopped, and Paolo, observing his agitation, and probably not relishing the adventure, endeavoured to dissuade him from further research. "For we know not who may inhabit this gloomy place, signor, or their numbers, and we are only two of us after all. Besides, signor, it was through that door yonder," and he pointed to the very spot whence Vivaldi had so fearfully issued, "through that door that I fancied just now that I saw something pass." "Are you certain as to this?" said Vivaldi with increased emotion. "What was its form?" "It was so dusky thereabout, Maestro, that I could not distinguish." Vivaldi's eyes were fixed upon the building, and a violent conflict of feelings seemed to shake his soul. A few seconds decided it. "I will go in," said he, "and terminate, at any hazard, this state of intolerable anxiety. Paolo, pause a moment, and consider well whether you can depend on your courage, for it may be severely tried. If you can, descend with me in silence, and I warn you to be wary. If you cannot, I will go alone." "It is too late, signor, to ask myself that question," replied Paolo with a submissive air; "and if I had not settled it long ago, I should not have followed you thus far. My courage, signor, you never doubted before." "Come on, then," said Vivaldi. He drew his sword, and entering the narrow doorway, the torch which he had now resigned to Paolo showed a stone passage that was, however, interminable to the eye. As they proceeded, Paolo observed that the walls were stained in several places with what appeared to be blood, but prudently forbore to point this out to his master, observing the strict injunction of silence he had received. Vivaldi stepped cautiously, and often paused to listen, after which he went on with a quicker pace, making signs only Paolo to follow and be vigilant. The passage terminated in a staircase that seemed to lead to vaults below. Vivaldi remembered the light which had formerly appeared there, and as a recollection of the past gathered in his mind, he faltered in his purpose. Again he paused. He looked back on Paolo, but was going forward, when Paolo himself seized his arm. "Stop, signor," he said in a low voice. "Do you not distinguish a figure standing yonder, in the gloom?" Vivaldi looked onwards, and perceived indistinctly something as of human form, but motionless and silent. It stood at the dusky extremity of the avenue, near the staircase. Its garments, if garments they were dark, but its whole figure was so faintly traced to the eye that it was impossible to ascertain whether this was the monk. Vivaldi took the light and held it forward, endeavouring to distinguish the object before he ventured further; but the inquiry was useless, and resigning the torch to Paolo, he rushed on. When he reached the head of the staircase, however, the form, whatever it might be, was gone. Vivaldi had heard no footstep. Paolo pointed out the exact spot where it had stood, but no vestige of it appeared. Vivaldi called loudly upon the monk, but he heard only the lengthening echoes of his own voice revolving among the chambers below, and after hesitating a while on the head of the stairs, he descended. Paolo had not followed down many steps when he called out, "It is there, signor! I see it again, and now it flits away through the door that opens to the vaults." Vivaldi pursued so swiftly that Paolo could scarcely follow fast enough with the light, and as at length he rested to take breath, he perceived himself in the same spacious chamber to which he had formerly descended. At this moment Paolo perceived his countenance change. "You are ill, signor," said he. "In the name of our holy saint, let us quit this hideous place. Its inhabitants can be nothing good, and no good can come of our remaining here." Vivaldi made no reply. He drew breath with difficulty, and his eyes remained fixed on the ground, till a noise like the creaking of a heavy hinge rose in a distant part of the vault. Paolo turned his eyes at the same instant towards the place whence it came, and they both perceived a door in the wall slowly opened and immediately closed again, as if the person within had feared to be discovered. Each believed, from the transient view he had of it, that this was the same figure which had appeared on the staircase, and that it was the monk himself. Reanimated by this belief, Vivaldi's nerves were instantly rebraced, and he sprang to the door, which was unfastened, and yielded immediately to his impetuous hand. "You shall not deceive me now," he cried as he entered. "Paolo, keep guard at the door." He looked round the second vault, in which he now found himself, but no person appeared. He examined the place, and particularly the walls, without discovering any aperture, whether of door or window, by which the figure could have quitted the chamber. A strongly gated casement, placed near the roof, was all that admitted air, and probably light. Vivaldi was astonished. "Have you seen anything pass?" said he to Paolo. "Nothing, maestro," replied the servant. "This is almost incredible," exclaimed Vivaldi. "'Tis certain this form can be nothing human." "If so, signor," observed Paolo, "why should it fear us, as it surely does? Or why would it have fled?" "That is not so certain," rejoined Vivaldi. "It may have fled only to lead us into evil. But bring hither the torch. Here is something in the wall which I would examine." Paolo obeyed. It was merely a ruggedness in the stones, not the partition of a door, that had excited its curiosity. "This is inexplicable!" exclaimed Vivaldi, after a long pause. "What motive could any human being have for thus tormenting me? Or any being superhuman either, my signor," said Paolo. "I am warned of evils that await me," continued Vivaldi, musing, "of events that are regularly fulfilled. The being who warns me crosses my path perpetually, yet with the cunning of a demon as constantly eludes my grasp and baffles my pursuit. It is incomprehensible by what means he glides thus away from my eye, and fades as if into air, at my approach. He is repeatedly in my presence, yet is never to be found." "It is most true, signor," said Paolo, "that he is never to be found, and therefore let me entreat you to give up the pursuit. This place is enough to make one believe in the horrors of purgatory. Let us go, signor." "What but spirit could have quitted this vault so mysteriously?" continued Vivaldi, not attending to Paolo. "What but spirit—" "I would fain prove," said the servant, "that substance can quit as easily. I would fain evaporate through that door myself." He had scarcely spoken the words when the door closed with a thundering clap that echoed through all the vaults, and Vivaldi and Paolo stood for a moment aghast, and then both hastened to open it and leave the place. Their consternation may be easily conceived when they found that all their efforts at the door were ineffectual. The thick wood was inlaid with solid bars of iron, and was of such unconquerable strength that it evidently guarded what had been designed for a prison, and appeared to be the keep or dungeon of the ancient fort. "Ah, signor mio!" said Paolo, If this was a spirit, 'tis plain he knew we were not so, by his luring us hither. Would we could exchange natures with him for a moment! For I know not how, as mere mortal men, we can ever squeeze ourselves out of this scrape. You must allow, Maestro, that this was not one of the evils he warned you of; or if he did, it was through my organs, for I entreated you." "Peace, good Signor Buffo," said Vivaldi. "A truce with this nonsense, and assist me in searching for some means of escape." Vivaldi again examined the walls, and as unsuccessfully as before. But in one corner of the vault lay an object, which seemed to tell the fate of one who had been confined here, and to hint his own. It was a garment covered with blood. Vivaldi and his servant discovered it at the same instant, and a dreadful foreboding of their own destiny fixed them, for some moments, to the spot. Vivaldi first recovered himself when, instead of yielding to despondency, all his faculties were aroused to devise some means for escaping. But Paolo's hopes seemed buried beneath the dreadful vestments upon which still he gazed. "Ah, my Senor," said he at length, in a faltering accent, "who shall dare to raise that garment? What if it should conceal the mangled body whose blood has stained it?" Vivaldi, shudderingly, turned to look on it again. "It moves!" exclaimed Paolo. "I see it move." As he said which, he started to the opposite side of the chamber. Vivaldi stepped a few paces back, and as quickly returned, when, determined to know the event at once, he raised the garment upon the point of his sword, and perceived beneath other remains of dress, heaped high together, while even the floor below was stained with gore. Believing that fear had deceived the eyes of Paolo, Vivaldi watched this horrible spectacle for some time, but without perceiving the least motion, when he became convinced that not any remains of life were shrouded beneath it, and it contained only articles of dress, which had belonged to some unfortunate person who had probably been decoyed hither for plunder, and afterwards murdered. This belief, and the repugnance he felt to dwell upon the spectacle, prevented him from examining further, and he turned away to a remote part of the vault. A conviction of his own fate and of his servants filled his mind for a while with despair. It appeared that he had been ensnared by robbers, till, as he recollected the circumstances which had attended his entrance, and the several peculiar occurrences connected with the archway, this conjecture seemed highly improbable. It was unreasonable that robbers should have taken the trouble to decoy, when they might at first have seized him; still more so that they would have persevered so long in the attempt; and most of all, that when he had formerly been in their power, they should have neglected their opportunity, and suffered him to leave the ruin unmolested. Yet, granting that all this, improbable as it was, were however possible, the solemn warnings and predictions of the monk, so frequently delivered and so faithfully fulfilled, could have no connection with the schemes of banditti. It appeared, therefore, that Vivaldi was not in the hands of robbers, or, if he were, that the monk at least had no connection with them. Yet it was certain that he had just heard the voice of this monk beneath the arch, and that his servant had said he saw the vestments of one ascending the steps of the fort, and that they both had reason afterwards to believe it was his shadowy figure, which they had pursued to the very chamber where they were now confined. As Vivaldi considered all these circumstances, his perplexity increased, and he was more than ever inclined to believe that the form which had assumed the appearance of a monk was something superhuman. "If this being had appeared only," said he to himself, "I should perhaps have thought it the perturbed spirit of him who doubtless has been murdered here, and that it led me hither to discover the deed, that his bones might be removed to holy ground. But this monk, or whatever it is, was neither silent nor apparently anxious concerning himself. He spoke only of events connected with my peace, and predicted of the future, as well as reverted to the past. If he had either hinted of himself or had been wholly silent, his appearance and manner of eluding pursuit is so extraordinary that I should have yielded for once, perhaps, to the tales of our grandfathers, and thought that he was the spectre of a murdered person. As Vivaldi expressed his incredulity, however, he returned to examine the garments once more, when, as he raised it, he observed what had before escaped his notice: black drapery mingled with the heap beneath, and on lifting this also with the point of his sword, he perceived part of the habiliment of a monk. He started at the discovery, as if he had seen the apparition which had so long been tempting his credulity. Here were the vest and scapulary, rent and stained with blood. Having gazed for a moment, he let them drop upon the heap, when Paolo, who had been silently observing him, said, "Signor, that should be the garment of the demon who led us hither. Is it a winding sheet for us, maestro, or was it one for the body he inhabited while on earth?" "Neither, I trust," replied Vivaldi, endeavouring to command the perturbation he suffered, and turning from the spectacle. "Therefore we will try once more to regain our liberty." This was a design, however, beyond his accomplishment, and having again attacked the door, raised Paolo to the grated window, and vociferated for release with his utmost strength, in which he was very ably seconded by Paolo, he abandoned for the present all further attempts, and, weary and desponding, threw himself on the ground of the dungeon. Paolo bitterly lamented his master's rashness in penetrating to this remote spot, and bewailed the probability of their being famished. "For supposing, signor, that we were not decoyed hither for plunder and butchery, and supposing that we are not surrounded by malicious spirits, which San Gennarius forbid, I should take upon me to confirm is impossible. Supposing all this, signor, yet still there remains almost a certainty of our being starved to death. For how is it possible that any body can hear our cries in a place so remote from all resort, and buried, as one may say, underground as this is?" "Thou art an excellent comforter," said Vivaldi, groaning. "You must allow, signor, that you are even with me," replied Paolo, "and that you are as excellent a conductor." Vivaldi gave no answer, but he lay on the ground, abandoned to agonising thought. He had now leisure to consider the late words of the monk, and to conjecture, for he was in a mood for conjecturing the worst, that they not only alluded to Helena, but that his saying she had departed an hour ago was a figurative manner of telling that she had died then. This was a conjecture which dispelled almost all apprehension for himself. He started from the ground and paced his prison with quick and unequal steps. It was no longer a heavy despondency that oppressed him, but an acute anxiety that stung him, and, with the tortures of suspense, brought also those of passionate impatience and horror concerning the fate of Helena. The longer he dwelt upon the possibility of her death, the more probable it appeared. This monk had already forewarned him of the death of Bianchi, and when he recollected the suspicious circumstances which had attended it, his terrors for Helena increased. The more he yielded to his feelings, the more violent they became, till at length his ungovernable impatience and apprehensions arose almost to frenzy. Paolo forgot for a while his own situation in the superior sufferings of his master, and now at least endeavoured to perform the offices of a comforter, for he tried to calm Vivaldi's mind by selecting the fairest circumstances for hope which the subject admitted, and he passed without noticing, or, if noticing, only lightly touched upon, the most prominent possibilities of evil. His master, however, was insensible to all he said, till he mentioned again the convent of Del Pianto; and this subject, as it seemed connected with the monk who had hinted the fate of Helena, interested the unhappy Vivaldi, who withdrew a while from his own reflections, to listen to a recital which might assist his conjectures. Paolo complied with this command, but not without reluctance. He looked round the empty vault, as if he feared that some person might be lurking in the obscurity who would overhear and even answer him. "We are tolerably retired here too, Signor," said he, recollecting himself. "One may venture to talk secrets with little danger of being discovered. However, Maestro, it is best to make matters quite sure; and therefore, if you will please take a seat on the ground, I will stand beside you, and relate all I know of the convent of Our Lady of Tears, which is not so much after all." Vivaldi having seated himself and bidden Paolo to do the same, the servant began in a low voice. "It was on the vigil of the Santo Marco, just after the last vesper bell had tolled. You never was at the Santa Maria del Pianto, Signor, or you would know what a gloomy old church it has. It was in a confessional in one of the side aisles of the church, and just after the last bell had ceased, that a person, so muffled up that neither face nor shape could be distinguished, came and placed himself on the steps of one of the boxes adjoining the confessional chair. But if he had been as airily dressed as yourself, Signor, he might have been just as well concealed, for that dusky aisle is lighted only by one lamp, which hangs at the end next the painted window, except when the tapers at the shrine of San Antonio happen to be burning at the other extremity, and even then the place is almost as gloomy as this vault. But that is no doubt contrived for the purpose, that people may not blush for the sins they confess; and in good faith this is an accommodation which may bring more money to the poor's box, for the monks have a shrewd eye that way, and—" "You have dropped the thread of your story," said Vivaldi. "True, Signor. Let me recollect where I lost it. On the steps of the confessional, the stranger knelt down upon them, and for some time poured such groans into the ear of the confessor as were heard all along the aisle. You are to know, Signor, that the brothers of Santa del Pianto are of the order of black penitents, and people who have more sins than ordinary to confess sometimes go there to consult with the grand penitentiary what is to be done. Now it happened that Father Ansaldo, the grand penitentiary himself, was in the chair, as is customary on the vigil of Santo Marco, and he gently reproved the penitent for bewailing so loud, and bade him take comfort, when the other replied only by a deeper groan than before, but it was not so loud, and then proceeded to confess. But what he did confess, Signor, I know not, for the confessor, you know, must never divulge, except indeed on very extraordinary occasions. It was, however, something so very strange and horrible, that the grand penitentiary suddenly quitted the chair, and before he reached the cloisters he fell into strong convulsions. On recovering himself, he asked the people about him whether the penitent who had visited such a confessional, naming it, was gone, adding that if he was still in the church, it was proper he should be detained. He described at the same time, as well as he could, the sort of figure he had dimly seen approaching the confessional just before he had received the confession, at recollecting which he seemed ready to go off again into his convulsions. One of the fathers who had crossed the aisle on his way to the cloisters upon the first alarm of Ansaldo's disorder, remembered that a person such as was described had passed him hastily. He had seen a tall figure, muffled up in the habit of a white friar, gliding swiftly along the aisle towards the door which opened into the outer court of the convent, but he was himself too much engaged to notice the stranger particularly. Father Ansaldo thought this must be the person, and the porter was summoned, and asked whether he had observed such as one pass. He affirmed that he had not seen any person go forth from the gate within the last quarter of an hour, which might be true enough, you know, Signor, if the rogue had been off his post; but he further said that no one had entered during the whole evening, habited in white, as the stranger was described to be, So the porter proved himself to be a vigilant watchman, for he must have been fast asleep too, or how could this personage have entered the convent and left it again without being seen by him? In white, was he? Said Vivaldi. If he had been in black, I should have thought this must have been the monk, my tormentor. Why, you know, signor, that occurred to me before, observed Paolo, and a man might easily change his dress, if that were all. Proceed, said Vivaldi. Hearing this account from the porter, continued Paolo, the fathers believed, one and all, that the stranger must be secreted within the walls, and the convent, which every part of its precincts was searched, but no person was found. This must certainly be the monk, said Vivaldi, notwithstanding the difference of his habit. There surely cannot be two beings in the world who would conduct themselves in this same mysterious manner. He was interrupted by a low sound, which seemed to his distracted fancy to proceed from a dying person. Paolo also heard it. He started, and they both listened with intense and almost intolerable expectation. "Ah," said Paolo at length, "it was only the wind." "It was no more," said Vivaldi. "Proceed, therefore." "From the period of this strange confession," resumed Paolo, "Father Ansaldo was never properly himself. He—" "Doubtless the crime confessed related to himself," observed Vivaldi. "Why, no, signor, I have never heard that was the case; and some remarkable circumstances which followed seem to prove it otherwise. About a month after the time I have mentioned, on the evening of a sultry day, when the monks were retiring from the last service—" "Hark!" cried Vivaldi. "I hear whispers," said Paolo, whispering himself. "Be still," said Vivaldi. They listened attentively, and heard a murmuring as of voices, but could not ascertain whether they came from the adjoining vault, or arose from beneath the one in which they were. The sound returned at intervals, and the persons who conversed, whatever they were, seemingly restrained their voices, as if they feared to be heard. Vivaldi considered whether it were better to discover himself and call for assistance, or to remain still. "Remember, signor," said Paolo, "what a chance we have of being starved, unless we venture to discover ourselves to these people, or whatever they are." "Venture!" exclaimed Vivaldi. "What has such a wretch as I to do with fear? Oh, Elena, Elena!" He instantly called loudly to the person whom he believed he had heard, and was seconded by Paolo. But their continued vociferations availed them nothing. No answer was returned, and even the indistinct sounds which had awakened their attention were heard no more. Exhausted by their efforts, they lay down on the floor of the dungeon, abandoning all further attempts at escape, till the morning light might assist them. Vivaldi had no further spirit to inquire for the remainder of Paolo's narrative. Almost despairing for himself, he could not feel an interest concerning strangers, for he had already perceived that it could not afford him information connected with Elena; and Paolo, who had roared himself hoarse, was very willing to be silent.
End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of the Italian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Morant. The Italian by Ann Radcliffe. Chapter 7. Who may she be that steals through yonder cloister, and, as the beam of evening tints her veil, unconsciously discloses saintly features, informed with the high soul of saintly virtue? During several days after Ayena's arrival at the monastery of San Stefano, she was not permitted to leave the room. The door was locked upon her, and not any person appeared except the nun, who brought her a scanty portion of food, and who was the same that had first admitted her into that part of the convent appropriated to the abbess. On the fourth day, when probably it was believed that her spirits were subdued by confinement, and by her experience of the suffering she had to expect from resistance, she was summoned to the parlour. The abbess was alone, and the air of austerity with which she regarded Ayena prepared the latter to endure. After an exordium on the heinousness of her offence, and the necessity there was for taking measures to protect the peace and dignity of a noble family which her late conduct had nearly destroyed, the abbess informed her that she must determine either to accept the veil or the person whom the Marchesa di Vivaldi had, of her great goodness, selected for her husband. "You never can be sufficiently grateful," added the abbess, "for the generosity the Marchesa displays in allowing you a choice on the subject. After the injury you have endeavoured to inflict upon her and her family, you could not expect that any indulgence would be shewn you. It was natural to suppose that the Marchesa would have punished you with severity, instead of which she allows you to enter into our society, or, if you have not strength of mind sufficient to enable you to renounce a sinful world, she permits you to return into it, and gives you a suitable partner to support you through its cares and toils, a partner much more suitable to your circumstances than him to whom you had the temerity to lift your eye." Ayena blushed at this coarse appeal to her pride, and persevered in a disdainful silence. Thus to give to injustice the colouring of mercy, and to acts more absolutely tyrannical the softening tints of generosity, excited her honest indignation. She was not, however, shocked by a discovery of the designs formed against her, since from the moment of her arrival at San Stefano she had expected something terribly severe, and had prepared her mind to meet it with fortitude. For she believed that, so supported, she should weary the malice of her enemies, and finally triumph over misfortune. It was only when she thought of Vivaldi that her courage failed, and that the injuries she endured seemed too heavy to be long sustained. "You are silent?" said the abbess, after a pause of expectation. "Is it possible, then, that you can be ungrateful for the generosity of the Marchesa? But though you may at present be insensible to her goodness, I will forbear to take advantage of your indiscretion, and will still allow you liberty of choice. You may retire to your chamber to consider and to decide, but remember that you must abide by the determination you shall avow, and that you will be allowed no appeal from the alternatives which are now placed before you. If you reject the veil, you must accept the husband who is offered you." "It is unnecessary," said Elena, with an air of dignified tranquillity, "that I should withdraw for the purposes of considering and deciding. My resolution is already taken, and I reject each of the offered alternatives. I will neither condemn myself to a cloister, or to the degradation with which I am threatened on the other hand. Having said this, I am prepared to meet whatever suffering you shall inflict upon me, but be assured that my own voice never shall sanction the evils to which I may be subjected, and that the immortal love of justice, which fills all my heart, will sustain my courage no less powerfully than the sense of what is due to my own character. You are now acquainted with my sentiments and my resolutions. I shall repeat them no more." The abbess, whose surprise had thus long suffered Aliena to speak, still fixed upon her a stern regard as she said, "Where is it that you have learned these heroics, and acquired the rashness which thus prompts you to avow them? The boldness which enables you to insult your superior, a priestess of your holy religion, even in her sanctuary?" "The sanctuary is profane," said Elena, mildly, but with dignity. "It is become a prison. It is only when the superior ceases to respect the precepts of that holy religion, the precepts which teach her justice and benevolence, that she herself is no longer respected. The very sentiment which bids us revere its mild and beneficent laws, bids us also reject the violators of them. When you command me to reverence my religion, you urge me to condemn yourself." "Withdraw," said the abbess, rising impatiently from her chair. "Your admonition, so becomingly delivered, shall not be forgotten." Aliena willingly obeyed, and was led back to her cell, where she sat down pensively, and reviewed her conduct. Her judgment approved of the frankness with which she had asserted her rights, and of the firmness with which she had reproved a woman who had dared to demand respect from the very victim of her cruelty and oppression. She was the more satisfied with herself because she had never for an instant forgotten her own dignity so far, as to degenerate into a vehemence of passion, or to falter with the weakness of fear. Her conviction of the abbess's unworthy character was too clear to allow Aliena to feel abashed in her presence, for she regarded only the censure of the good, to which she had ever been as tremblingly alive, as she was obdurately insensible to that of the vicious. Aliena, having now asserted her resolutions, determined to avoid, if possible, all repetition of scenes like the last, and to repel by silence only whatever indignity might be offered her. She knew that she must suffer, and she resolved to endure. Of the three evils which were placed before her, that of confinement, with all its melancholy accompaniments, appeared considerably less severe than either the threatened marriage or a formal renunciation of the world, either of which would devote her during life to misery, and that by her own act. Her choice, therefore, had been easy, and the way was plain before her. If she could endure with calmness the hardships which she could not avoid, half their weight would be unfelt, and she now most strenuously endeavoured to attain the strength of mind which was necessary to support such equanimity. For several days after the late interview with the abbess she was kept a close prisoner, but on the 5th evening she was permitted to attend vespers. As she walked through the garden to the chapel, the ordinary freshness of the open air, and the verdure of the trees and shrubs were luxuries to her, who had so long been restricted from the common blessings of nature. She followed the nuns to a chapel where they usually performed their devotions, and was there seated among the novices. The solemnity of the service, and particularly of those parts which were accompanied by music, touched all her heart, and soothed and elevated her spirit. Among the voices of the choir was one whose expression immediately fixed her attention. It seemed to speak a loftier sentiment of devotion than the others, and to be modulated by the melancholy of a heart that had long since taken leave of this world. Whether it swelled with the high peal of the organ, or mingled in low and trembling accents with sinking chorus, Aliena felt that she understood all the feelings of the breast from which it flowed, and she looked to the gallery where the nuns were assembled to discover a countenance that might seem to accord with the sensibility expressed in the voice. As no strangers were admitted to the chapel, some of the sisters had thrown back their veils, and she saw little that interested her in their various faces. But the figure and attitude of a nun, kneeling in a remote part of the gallery, beneath a lamp, which threw its rays aslant her head, perfectly agreed with the idea she had formed of the singer, and the sound seemed to approach immediately from that direction. Her face was concealed by a black veil. whose transparency, however, permitted the fairness of her complexion to appear. But the air of her head, and the singularity of her attitude, for she was the only person who remained kneeling, sufficiently indicated the superior degree of fervency and penitence which the voice had expressed. When the hymn had ceased, she rose from her knees, and Iena, soon after, observing her throw back her veil, discovered, by the lamp, which shed its full light upon her features, a countenance that instantly confirmed her conjecture. It was touched with a melancholy kind of resignation, yet grief seemed still to occasion the paleness and the air of languor that prevailed over it, and which disappeared only when the momentary energy of devotion seemed to lift her spirit above this world, and impart to it somewhat of a seraphic grandeur. At those moments her blue eyes were raised towards heaven, with such meek yet fervent love, such sublime enthusiasm as the heads of Guido sometimes display, and which renewed, with Iena, all the enchanting effects of the voice she had just heard. While she regarded the nun with a degree of interest which rendered her insensible to every other object in the chapel, she fancied she could perceive the calmness in her countenance to be that of despair rather than of resignation, for, when her thoughts were not elevated in prayer, there was frequently a fixedness in her look, too energetic for common suffering, or for the temper of mind which may lead to perfect resignation. It had, however, much that attached the sympathy of Iena, and much that seemed to speak a similarity of feeling. Iena was not only soothed, but in some degree comforted, while she gazed upon her, a selfishness which may, perhaps, be pardoned when it is considered that she thus knew there was one human being, at least, in the convent who must be capable of feeling pity, and willing to administer consolation. Iena endeavoured to meet her eye, that she might inform her of the regard she had inspired, and express her own unhappiness, but the nun was so entirely engaged by devotion that she did not succeed. As they left the chapel, however, the nun passed close by Iena, who threw back her veil, and fixed upon her a look so supplicating and expressive that the nun paused, and in her turn regarded the novice, not with surprise only, but with a mixture of curiosity and compassion. A faint blush crossed her cheek. Her spirits seemed to falter, and she was unwilling to withdraw her eyes from Iena. But it was necessary that she should continue in the procession, and, bidding her farewell by a smile of ineffable pity, she passed on to the court, while Iena followed with attention still fixed upon the sister, who soon disappeared beyond the doorway of the abbess's apartment, and Iena had nearly reached her own before her thoughts were sufficiently disengaged to permit her to inquire the name of the stranger. "It is Sister Olivia whom you mean, perhaps," said her conductress. "She is very handsome," said Iena. "Many of the sisters are so," replied Margheritone, with an air of pique. "Undoubtedly," said Iena, "but she whom I mean has a most touching countenance, frank, noble, full of sensibility, and there is a gentle melancholy in her eye which cannot but interest all who observe her." Iena was so fascinated by this interesting nun that she forgot she was describing her to a person, whose callous heart rendered her insensible to the influence of any countenance except, perhaps, the commanding one of the lady abbess, and to whom, therefore, a description of the fine traits which Iena felt was as unintelligible as would have been an Arabic inscription. "She is past the bloom of youth," continued Iena, still anxious to be understood, "but she retains all its interesting graces, and adds to them the dignity of—" "If you mean that she is of middle age," interrupted Margheritone, peevishly, "it is Sister Olivia you mention, for we are all younger than she is." Iena, raising her eyes almost unconsciously as the nun spoke this, fixed them upon a face fallow, meagre, seemingly near 50 years an inhabitant of this world, and she could scarcely suppress the surprise she felt, on perceiving such wretched vanity lingering among the chilled passions of so repulsive a frame, and within the sequestered shade of a cloister. Margaritone, still jealous of the praise bestowed on Olivia, repelled all further inquiry, and, having attended Iena to her cell, locked her up for the night. On the following evening Iena was again permitted to attend vespers, and on the way to the chapel the hopes of seeing her interesting favourite reanimated her spirits. In the same part of the gallery as on the preceding night, she again appeared, and kneeling, as before, beneath the lamp, in private orison, for the service was not begun. Iena endeavoured to subdue the impatience she felt to express her regard, and to be noticed by the holy sister, till she should have finished. When the nun rose and observed Iena, she lifted her veil, and, fixing on her the same inquiring eye, her countenance brightened into a smile so full of compassion and intelligence that Iena, forgetting the decorums of the place, left her seat to approach her. It seemed as if the soul which beamed forth in that smile had long been acquainted with hers. As she advanced, the nun dropped her veil, a reproof which she immediately understood, and she withdrew to her seat, but her attention remained fixed on the nun during the whole service. At the conclusion, when they left the chapel, and she saw Olivia pass without noticing her, Iena could scarcely restrain her tears. She returned in deep dejection to her room. The regard of this nun was not only delightful, but seemed necessary to her heart, and she dwelt with fond perseverance on the smile that had expressed so much, and which threw one gleam of comfort even through the bars of her prison. Her reverie was soon interrupted by a light step that approached her cell, and in the next moment the door was unlocked, and Olivia herself appeared. Iena rose with emotion to meet her. The nun held forth her hand to receive hers. "You are unused to confinement," said she, curtsying mournfully, and placing on the table a little basket containing refreshment, "and our hard fare." "I understand you," said Iena, with a look expressive of her gratitude. "You have a heart that can pity, though you inhabit these walls. You have suffered too, and know the delicate generosity of softening the sorrows of others by any attention that may tell them your sympathy. Oh, if I could express how much the sense of this affects me!" Tears interrupted her. Olivia pressed her hand, looked steadily upon her face, and was somewhat agitated, but she soon recovered apparent tranquillity, and said with a serious smile, "You judge rightly, my sister, respecting my sentiments, however you may do concerning my sufferings. My heart is not insensible to pity, nor to you, my child. You were designed for happier days than you can hope to find within these cloisters." She checked herself as if she had allowed too much, and then added, "But you may, perhaps, be peaceful, and since it consoles you to know that you have a friend near you, believe me that friend, but believe it in silence. I will visit you when I am permitted, but do not inquire for me, and if my visits are short, do not press me to lengthen them." "How good this is!" said Iena in a faltering voice. "How sweet, too, it is! You will visit me, and I am pitied by you." "Hush!" said the nun, expressively. "No more! I may be observed. Good night, my sister. May your slumbers be light." Iena's heart sunk. She had not spirits to say "good night," but her eyes, covered with tears, said more. The nun turned her own way suddenly, and pressing her hand in silence, left the cell. Iena, firm and tranquil under the insults of the abbess, was now melted into tears by the kindness of a friend. These gentle tears were refreshing to her long oppressed spirits, and she indulged them. Of Vivaldi she thought with more composure than she had done since she left the Villa Altieri, and something like hope began to revive in her heart, though reflection offered nothing to support it. On the following morning she perceived that the door of her cell had not been closed. She rose impatiently, and not without a hope of liberty immediately passed it. The cell, opening upon a short passage which communicated with the main building and which was shut up by a door, was secluded and almost insulated from every other chamber, and this door being now secured, Iena was as truly a prisoner as before. It appeared then that the nun had omitted to fasten the cell only for the purpose of allowing her more space to walk in the passage, and she was grateful for the attention. Still more she was so when, having traversed it, she perceived one extremity terminate in a narrow staircase that appeared to lead to other chambers. She ascended the winding steps hastily, and found they led only to a door, opening into a small room, where nothing remarkable appeared, till she approached the windows, and beheld thence a horizon, and a landscape spread below, whose grandeur awakened all her heart. The consciousness of her prison was lost, while her eyes ranged over the wide and freely sublime scene without. She perceived that this chamber was within a small turret, projecting from an angle of the convent over the walls, and suspended, as in air, above the vast precipices of granite that formed part of the mountain. These precipices were broken into cliffs, which, in some places, impended far above their base, and, in others, rose, in nearly perpendicular lines, to the walls of the monastery which they supported. Iena, with a dreadful pleasure, looked down them, shagged as they were with larch, and frequently darkened by lines of gigantic pine bending along the rocky ledges, till her eye rested on the thick chestnut woods that extended over their winding base, and which, softening to the plains, seemed to form a gradation between the variegated cultivation there and the awful wildness of the rocks above. Round these extensive plains were tumbled the mountains of various shape and altitude which Iena had admired on her approach to San Stefano, some shaded with forests of olive and almond trees, but the greater part abandoned to the flocks, which in summer feed on their aromatic herbage, and on the approach of winter descend to the sheltered plains of the Tavoglie di Puglia. On the left opened the dreadful pass which she had traversed, and the thunder of whose waters now murmured at a distance. The accumulation of overtopping points which the mountains of this dark perspective exhibited presented an image of grandeur superior to anything she had seen while within the pass itself. To Iena, whose mind was capable of being highly elevated, or sweetly soothed, by scenes of nature, the discovery of this little turret was an important circumstance. Hither she could come, and her soul, refreshed by the views it afforded, would acquire strength to bear her, with equanimity, through the persecutions that might await her. Here, gazing upon the stupendous imagery around her, looking, as it were, beyond the awful veil which obscures the features of the Deity and conceals him from the eyes of his creatures, dwelling as with the present God in the midst of his sublime works, with a mind thus elevated, how insignificant would appear to her the transactions and the sufferings of this world, how poor the boasted power of man, when the fall of a single cliff from these mountains would with ease destroy thousands of his race assembled on the plains below. How would it avail them that they were accoutred for battle, armed with all the instruments of destruction that human invention ever fashioned? Thus man, the giant who now held her in captivity, would shrink to the diminutiveness of a fairy, and she would experience that his utmost force was unable to enchain her soul or to compel her to fear him, while he was destitute of virtue. Iena's attention was recalled from the scene without by a sound from within the gallery, and she then heard a key turning in the door of the passage. Fearing that it was Sister Margheritone who approached, and who, informed by her absence of the consolatory turret she had discovered, would perhaps debar her from ever returning to it, Iena descended with a palpitating heart, and found that nun in the cell. Surprise and severity were in her countenance when she inquired by what means Iena had unclosed the door, and whither she had been. Iena answered without any prevarication that she had found the door unfastened, and that she had visited the turret above, but she forbore to express a wish to return thither, judging that such an expression would certainly exclude her in future. Margaritone, after sharply rebuking her for prying beyond the passage, and setting down the breakfast she had brought, left the room, the door of which she did not forget to secure. Thus Iena was at once deprived of so innocent a means of consolation as her pleasant turret had afforded. During several days she saw only the austere nun, except when she attended vespers, where, however, she was so vigilantly observed that she feared to speak with Olivia, even by her eyes. Olivia's were often fixed upon her face, and with a kind of expression which Iena, when she did venture to look at her, could not perfectly interpret. It was not only of pity, but of anxious curiosity, and of something also like fear. A blush would sometimes wander over her cheek, which was succeeded by an extreme paleness, and by an air of such universal languor as precedes a fainting fit. But the exercises of devotion seemed frequently to recall her fleeting spirits, and to elevate them with hope and courage. When she left the chapel, Iena saw Olivia no more that night, but on the following morning she came with breakfast to the cell. A character of peculiar sadness was on her brow. "Oh, how glad I am to see you!" said Iena, "and how much I have regretted your long absence! I was obliged to remember constantly what you had enjoined, to forbear inquiring after you." The nun replied with a melancholy smile. "I come in obedience to our Lady Abbess," said she, as she seated herself on Iena's mattress. "And did you not wish to come?" said Iena mournfully. "I did wish it," replied Olivia, "but—" and she hesitated. "Whence then this reluctance?" inquired Iena. Olivia was silent a moment. "You are a messenger of evil news," said Iena. "You are only reluctant to afflict me." "It is as you say," replied Olivia. "I am only reluctant to afflict you, and I fear you have too many attachments to the world to allow you to receive, without sorrow, what I have to communicate. I am ordered to prepare you for the vows, and to say that, since you have rejected the husband which was proposed to you, you are to accept the veil, that many of the customary forms are to be dispensed with, and that the ceremony of taking the black veil will follow without delay that of receiving the white one." The nun paused, and Iena said, "You are an unwilling bearer of this cruel message, and I reply only to the Lady Abbess when I declare that I never will accept either, that force may send me to the altar, but that it never shall compel me to utter vows which my heart abhors, and if I am constrained to appear there, it shall be only to protest against her tyranny, and against the form intended to sanction it." To Olivia this answer was so far from being displeasing that it appeared to give her satisfaction. "I dare not applaud your resolution," said she, "but I will not condemn it. You have, no doubt, connections in the world which would render a seclusion from it afflicting. You have relations, friends, from whom it would be dreadful to part?" "I have neither," said Iena, sighing. "No! Can that be possible? And yet you are so unwilling to retire?" "I have only one friend," replied Iena, "and it is of him they would deprive me." "Pardon, my love, the abruptness of these enquiries," said Olivia. "Yet, while I entreat your forgiveness, I am inclined to offend again, and to ask your name." "That is a question I will readily answer. My name is Iena di Risolba." "How?" said Olivia, with an air of deliberation. "Iena di Risolba," repeated her companion. "And permit me to ask your motive for the enquiry. Do you know any person of my name?" "No," replied the nun mournfully. but your features have some resemblance to those of a friend I once had." As she said this, her agitation was apparent, and she rose to go. "I must not lengthen my visit, lest I should be forbidden to repeat it," said she. "What answer shall I give to the abbess? If you are determined to reject the veil, allow me to advise you to soften your refusal as much as possible. I am, perhaps, better acquainted with her character than you are, and oh, my sister, I would not see you pining away your existence in this solitary cell." "How much I am obliged by the interest you express for my welfare," said Agenna, "and by the advice you offer! I will yield my judgment in this instance to yours. You shall modulate my refusal as you think proper, but remember that it must be absolute, and beware lest the abbess should mistake gentleness for irresolution." "Trust me, I will be cautious in all that relates to you," said Olivia. "Farewell. I will visit you, if possible, in the evening. In the meantime, the door shall be left open, that you may have more air and prospect than this cell affords. That staircase leads to a pleasant chamber." "I have visited it already," replied Agenna, "and have to thank you for the goodness which permitted me to do so. To go thither will greatly soothe my spirits. If I had some book and my drawing instruments, I could almost forget my sorrows there." "Could you so?" said the nun, with an affectionate smile. "Adieu. I will endeavour to see you in the evening. If Sister Margaritone returns, be careful not to inquire for me, nor once ask her for the little indulgence I give you." Olivia withdrew, and Agenna retired to the chamber above, where she lost for a while all sense of sorrow amidst the great scenery which its window exhibited. At noon, the step of Margaritone summoned Agenna from her retreat, and she was surprised that no reproof followed this second discovery of her absence. Margaritone only said that the abbess had the goodness to permit Agenna to dine with the novices, and that she came to conduct her to their table. Agenna did not rejoice in this permission, preferring to remain in her solitary turret to being exposed to the examining eyes of strangers, and she followed dejectedly through the silent passages to the apartment where they were assembled. She was not less surprised than embarrassed to observe, in the manners of young people residing in a convent, an absence of that decorum which includes beneath its modest shade every grace that ought to adorn the female character, like the veil which gives dignity to their air and softness to their features. When Agenna entered the room, the eyes of the whole company were immediately fixed upon her. The young ladies began to whisper and smile, and shewed by various means that she was the subject of conversation, not otherwise than censorious. No one advanced to meet and to encourage her, to welcome her to the table, or still less display one of those nameless graces with which a generous and delicate mind delights to reanimate the modest and the unfortunate. Agenna took a chair in silence, and though she had at first felt forlorn and embarrassed by the impertinent manners of her companions, a consciousness of innocence gradually revived her spirits, and enabled her to resume an air of dignity which repressed this rude presumption. Agenna returned to herself, for the first time, with eagerness. Margaritone did not fasten the door of it, but she was careful to secure that of the passage, and even this small indulgence she seemed to allow with a surly reluctance, as if compelled to obey the command of a superior. The moment she was gone, Agenna withdrew to her pleasant turret, where, after having suffered from the coarse manners of the novices, her gratitude was the more lively when she perceived the delicate attention of her beloved nun. It appeared that she had visited the chamber in Agenna's absence, and had caused to be brought thither a chair and a table, on which were placed some books, and a knot of fragrant flowers. Agenna did not repress the grateful tears which the generous feelings of Olivia excited, and she forbore for some moments to examine the books, that the pleasing emotions she experienced might not be interrupted. On looking into these books, however, she perceived that some of them treated of mystical subjects, which she laid aside with disappointment. But in others she observed a few of the best Italian poets, and a volume or two of Guido Ciardini's history. She was somewhat surprised that the poets should have found their way to the library of a nun, but was too pleased with the discovery to dwell on the inquiry. Having arranged her books and set her little room in order, she seated herself at a window, and with a volume of Tasso endeavoured to banish every painful remembrance from her mind. She continued wandering in the imaginary scenes of the poet, till the fading light recalled her to those of reality. The sun was set, but the mountain tops were still lighted up by his beams, and a tint of glorious purple coloured all the west, and began to change the snowy points on the horizon. The silence and repose of the vast scene promoted the tender melancholy that prevailed in her heart. She thought of Vivaldi, and wept. Of Vivaldi, whom she might, perhaps, never see again, though she doubted not that he would be indefatigable in searching for her. Every particular of their last conversation, when he had so earnestly lamented the approaching separation, even while he allowed of its propriety, came to her mind; and while she witnessed in imagination the grief and distraction which her mysterious departure and absence must have occasioned him, the fortitude with which she had resisted her own sufferings yielded to the picture of his. The vesper bell at length summoned her to prepare for Mass, and she descended to her cell to await the arrival of her conductress. It was Margheritone, who soon appeared, but in the chapel she, as usual, saw Olivia, who, when the service had concluded, invited her into the garden of the convent. There, as she walked beneath the melancholy cypresses that ranged on either side the long walks, formed a majestic canopy, almost excluding the evening twilight, Olivia conversed with her on serious but general topics, carefully avoiding any mention of the abbess and of the fairs of Iena. The latter, anxious to learn the effect of her repeated rejection of the veil, ventured to make some enquiries, which the nun immediately discouraged, and as cautiously checked the grateful effusions of her young friend for the attentions she had received. Olivia accompanied Iena to her cell, and there no longer scrupled to relieve her from uncertainty. With a mixture of frankness and discretion, she related as much of the conversation that had passed between herself and the abbess as it appeared necessary for Iena to know, from which it seemed that the former was as obstinate as the latter was firm. "Whatever may be your resolution," added the nun, "I earnestly advise you, sister, to allow the Superior some hope of compliance, lest she proceed to extremities." "And what extremity can be more terrible," replied Iena, "than either of those to which she would now urge me? Why should I descend to practise dissimulation?" "To save yourself from undeserved sufferings," said Olivia mournfully. "Yes, but I should then incur deserved ones," observed Iena, "and forfeit such peace of mind as my oppressors never could restore to me." As she said this, she looked at the nun with an expression of gentle reproach and disappointment. "I applaud the justness of your sentiment," replied Olivia, regarding her with tenderest compassion. "Alas, that a mind so noble should be subjected to the power of injustice and depravity." "Not subjected," said Iena. "Do not say subjected. I have accustomed myself to contemplate those sufferings. I have chosen the least of such as were given to my choice, and I will endure them with fortitude. And can you then say that I am subjected?" "Alas, my sister, you know not what you promise," replied Olivia. "You do not comprehend the sufferings which may be preparing for you." As she spoke, her eyes filled with tears, and she withdrew them from Iena, who, surprised at the extreme concern on her countenance, entreated she would explain herself. "I am not certain myself as to this point," said Olivia, "and if I were, I should not dare to explain it." "Not dare!" repeated Iena mournfully. "Can benevolence like yours know fear, when courage is necessary to prevent evil?" "Inquire no further," said Olivia, but no blush of conscious duplicity stained her cheek. "It is sufficient that you understand the consequence of open resistance to be terrible, and that you consent to avoid it." "But how avoid it, my beloved friend, without incurring a consequence which, in my apprehension, would be yet more dreadful? How avoid it without either subjecting myself to a hateful marriage or accepting the vows? Either of these events would be more terrible to me than anything which I may be menaced." "Perhaps not," said the nun, Imagination cannot draw the horror of... But, my sister, let me repeat that I would save you, oh, how willingly save you from the evils preparing, and that the only chance of doing so is by prevailing with you to abandon at least the appearance of resistance. Your kindness deeply affects me, said Ayanna, and I am fearful of appearing insensible of it when I reject your advice, yet I cannot adopt it. The very dissimulation which I should employ in self-defence might be a means of involving me in destruction. As Ayanna concluded, and her eyes glanced upon the nun, unaccountable suspicion occurred to her, that Olivia might be insincere, and that at this very moment when she was advising dissimulation, she was endeavouring to draw Ayanna into some snare which the abbess had laid. She sickened at this dreadful supposition, and dismissed it without suffering herself to examine its probability. That Olivia, from whom she had received so many attentions, whose countenance and manners announced so fair a mind, and for whom she had conceived so much esteem and affection, should be cruel and treacherous, was a suspicion that gave her more pain than the actual imprisonment in which she suffered, and when she looked again upon her face, Ayanna was consoled by a clear conviction that she was utterly incapable of perfidy. If it were possible that I could consent to practice deceit, resumed Ayanna after a long pause, what could it avail me? I am entirely in the power of the abbess, who would soon put my sincerity to the proof, when a discovery of my duplicity would only provoke her vengeance, and I should be punished even for having sought to avoid injustice. If deceit is at any time excusable, replied Olivia reluctantly, it is when we practice it in self-defence. There are some rare situations when it may be resorted to without our incurring ignominy, and yours is one of those. But I will acknowledge that all the good I expect is from the delay which temporizing may procure you. The superior, when she understands there is a probability of obtaining your consent to her wishes, may be willing to allow you the usual time of preparation for the veil, and meanwhile something may occur to rescue you from your present situation. Ah, could I but believe so, said Ayanna. But alas, what power can rescue me? And I have not one relative remaining even to attempt my deliverance. To what possibility do you allude? The Marchesa may relent. Does, then, your possibility of good rest with her, my dear friend? If so, I am in despair again. For such a chance of benefit, there would certainly be little policy in forfeiting one's integrity. There are also other possibilities, my sister, said Olivia. But hark! What bell is that? It is the chime which assembles the nuns in the apartment of the abbess, where she dispenses her evening benediction. My absence will be observed. Good night, my sister. Reflect on what I have advised, and remember, I conjure you, to consider that the consequence of your decision must be solemn, and may be fatal. The nun spoke this with a look of emphasis so extraordinary that Ayanna at once wished and dreaded to know more, but before she had recovered from her surprise, Olivia had left the room. End of chapter 8. Recording by Liz Morant of Port Richey, Florida. lizmorant@gmail.com.
Thank you so much for joining me for another chapter and another row of progress. If you're enjoying this audiobook plus diamond painting combo, I'd love if you like the video, subscribe, or just say hi in the comments. I'll see you soon in part 7. We're creeping closer to the halfway point. Until then, bye bye!